it's become common practice. A client sends you an email and it's obviously an AI product. They have asked AI a question about their case, gotten this feedback from AI, and they've then sent it to you as a question from them to you, right? Um, and so that's here. It's changing their perspectives because now they're not so um, focused on us as their guide. They've got ChatGPT or Claude or whoever um, telling them what to think. And so we've got AI looking over our shoulder, and we've got to be able to, you know, explain why we've done what we've done.
Welcome to the Verdict Signal podcast, where we feature how top attorneys help people make informed choices, avoid common mistakes, and move forward with confidence. Now, enjoy the show, and here's your host.
Daniel Gao here. I'm the host of Verdict Signal, and today we're expanding our conversations to the experts who protect what people build, their careers, families, and businesses. I have Bret Griffin, a personal injury attorney from Houston, Texas, who practices at the Busby Law Firm. He has been to a trial over 110 occasions as a former prosecutor, judge, and personal injury attorney. He recently graduated from the Jerry Spence Method Trial College in 2024, where he learned to connect with the jury, clients, and witnesses through the storytelling techniques taught by Jerry Spence. So, Bret, welcome and glad to have you here.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, Daniel, and I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so let's start at the very top, Bret. How did you first get interested in the legal field?
So my dad was a doctor and talked me out of going into medicine.
Mm.
And so one of the only other professions that I had any exposure to through his use of lawyers was the law profession.
Mm-hmm.
And so so in addition to that, I just kind of instinctually like to take up for people.
Mm-hmm.
As a young kid, I was prone to fight, but not just picking fights. It was usually on behalf of somebody who was getting picked on.
Mm-hmm.
So those two things just kind of melded together, and it just seemed like the right thing to do. Like, although I went to law school not knowing exactly what a lawyer does, like I had really had no idea,
Uh-huh.
and was surprised after graduating law school to find out what a lawyer actually does, because they don't teach you about the practice of law in law school.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
it's a bit of an enigma that you learn on the job.
So with that in mind, how did that lead you into personal injury law? Like in your introduction, like you were a prosecutor before, also a judge as well. So I mean, what was kind of your journey to where you end up now in personal injury law?
So, when you're a young father and you have a family, you look for a job. Someone's going to pay you a salary, and being a prosecutor afforded me that stable income so that I could, provide for a young family. And I did that for 6, 7, 8 years, until it just got so stressful that I just couldn't do it anymore. You're really dealing with the underbelly of society, seeing the worst of what people can do to each other.
Mm.
And so I left. I just went out into private practice. One of my friends, Tony Busby, was, I guess, crazy enough to get me appointed to finish the term of a judge that was leaving the bench early to run for a different political office.
Mm.
And he happened to be friends with the governor at the time. And so he got me appointed to finish that term. That's how I got to be a judge.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had to run for reelection, which fortunately I lost because I didn't enjoy being a judge. It's not a fun job. It's not anything like what you see in the movies or on television. It's really kind of a frustrating job.
Mm.
So anyway, so I was fortunate enough not to get reelected.
Mm.
And as I was ending that, Tony comes in and says, "Hey man, I know I kind of screwed up your career. I'm going to give you a place to land and get your feet back under you. Come to work at the Busby Law Firm."
Mm.
And so that's what I've been doing for the last 10 or 11 years.
Okay. Now, when it comes to people working with an attorney, working with a lawyer, what's one thing you wish more people understood about working with an attorney?
So it's really what I get from my clients is that they are just helpless. They don't understand how it works. They don't understand the process. I mean, it's almost like the public thinks that we sprinkle a little pixie dust over the courtroom and we come out with a bunch of money. They really have no concept of what we do or how we do it.
Mhm.
And so you're really put into almost a parental role where you're teaching them what the process is and how to make your way through it. So you really become, part parent, part guide, where you're on a hike and you're guiding them through the hike. Because there are all kinds of pitfalls that jump up in every case. Every case is different. And if you weren't aware, as a client usually isn't, then you would fall victim to them and your case would lose value, lose any kind of momentum, and just end up not amounting to much. So there's a real sense of guidance and coaching, and by the end of it, what I have found is I become friends with a lot of my clients. So you really, as you talked about with the Jerry Spence method, you end up connecting with them, teaching them, and growing with them through the case, because it takes 2 or 3 years, and by the end of it, you're friends.
Mhm.
Most of the time.
Yeah.
Sometimes you're friends, but you're not on good footing. They're
Yeah.
mad at you for something or other. So that happens.
Okay. Now, when it comes to working with a lawyer, I think that there's a lot of people that when they view working with a lawyer, maybe there's some hesitation, whether it's through biases or unfair portrayals in the media. But I think when people think about working with lawyers, they may think about, well, maybe I shouldn't tell them all the bad stuff because I don't want them to get me in trouble or anything along those lines, when really you are their advocate and you are representing them as almost like their protector, I'll call it, for lack of a better word. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, really, do you believe that your clients should kind of tell you everything to the full extent that they trust you? Because the more you know, the more you're able to better represent them, and you're not there to get them in trouble or judge them or anything along those lines.
Yeah, that's a real sensitive area in representation, and so in every case, for example, you have to put your client up for deposition. And one of the questions that they're going to ask every time is, at least in Texas, the way that it should be phrased is, in the last 10 years, have you been convicted of a felony or a crime of moral turpitude? And a lot of times your clients aren't going to tell you that up front, and they think if they don't say anything to anybody, it's never going to come up. And, so that question gets posed at the deposition. And if they say no, but they were convicted 20 years ago and they're still on parole, then suddenly that conviction is exhibit number 1 for the defense at trial to show that they're not truthful. And so if you know about it ahead of time, you can disarm it. You can say, look, man, it doesn't really matter. You admit to it, own it up front, and that's the end of it. They can talk about it a little bit, but it's not going to come back to bite you as if you're a liar.
Mm.
So it's, that's the most common example of that. But, in personal injury, it's also, have you ever had injuries to similar areas of your body that you have injuries of now? And have you had medical treatment? And so what a lot of these people don't realize is that if they made a claim previously, say it was, 8 or 10 years ago, and they got in a car wreck and they had a lower back injury and they made a claim, well, the insurance company has a database of that. And they can go back and say, oh, he went to this doctor. Let's go get the records from that doctor and see what, MRI images are available and compare them to now. And they'll do that without you knowing, as the lawyer representing the client. And you never know. And then suddenly you're in the deposition and they're asking about this prior accident, and they're asking about this prior doctor, and they're asking about this prior MRI that showed the same thing he has now. And you're the one who's taken aback, put on the defensive, and your client's caught, having to answer questions that you didn't prepare them for.
Mm.
So those things, they happen, and it's the most common way, but they don't have to be bad for the case if you just expose it all up front.
Okay. So basically, the more that they share with you and tell you, the easier things are going to be.
Oh yeah. It goes without saying that if you don't share something with me, it's going to come back to bite you in the ass.
Okay. Good to know. Now, what would you say are some of the most common situations your clients come to you for? I mean, personal injury is kind of a broad sense. So are there like certain types of cases you typically kind of work with or specialize with? Or is it pretty broad? Like kind of anytime anyone gets injured, it falls under the umbrella of personal injury?
Yeah. So generally speaking, injuries happen with all types of activities, right? And so if it's not your fault, it's somebody else's fault, then that's a personal injury case. And most common amongst those is, motor vehicle accidents. I mean, it's like we've all driven our whole lives ever since we were 16, but, unfortunately, people get distracted, people are sleepy, people are prone to accident. And so those things happen a lot. That's the most common type of accident, right? The cases that I enjoy, the ones that I think are, more valuable for me to handle, are the refinery accidents, chemical plant accidents, where, they have 2,000 or 3,000 independent contractors out there working at a plant, trying to do what they call a turnaround, which is, basically deconstructing and rebuilding part of the plant within a 2 or 3 month period. And so there's a lot of activity, and these guys, they have OSHA safety standards and ANSI safety standards and the facility safety standards they're supposed to follow. But there's so much activity that they, just with almost uniformity, somebody gets hurt. Many people get hurt, as a matter of fact. And so those are the cases that I think are more fun to work on, because you have a set of standards. At least you have one, the safety standards of OSHA or ANSI, and then the plant itself. And you have a lot of people, a lot of companies with a lot of people interacting with each other, so that we have someone to point the finger at.
Refinery. Oh yeah, please go ahead.
Oh, that's just the type of case that I enjoy, because basically for a good personal injury case, you have a three-legged stool. You have liability, somebody did something wrong, it caused you an injury, and then you have deep pockets to recover from. And so having insurance, in a lot of times, is one of the most important parts of it. You can have very serious injuries, and in Texas, you have a $30,000 minimum policy for motor vehicles. You can have very serious injuries, but if all they got is $30,000 policy, then you can't really recover. It's a terrible situation. So the plants typically have big policies.
Okay. Now, refinery accidents seem like a very niche area of personal injury. How did you get into the refinery accident side?
Just at the Busby Law Firm, we work on a lot of those. I mean, it's one of the main things that other lawyers refer to us. And, it's they're expensive. It takes a lot of money to work them up. You got to hire some very pricey experts, and it's I guess it's intimidating to other law firms, lawyers, and they end up bringing in the cases, and so we get to work on a lot of them. We see a lot of different, and it's things as simple as stepping in a hole. I had a client who he was kind of the supervisor for the night crew. He's walking out to meet with them in a safety meeting, and in the middle of them is hanging I want to say it was a 12 or 14-inch pipe that's about 20 feet long, and somebody leans against it as they're having the safety meeting, and when they get off of it, they're like, oh God, and they get off of it. Well, it swings towards the supervisor, and he moves out of the way so that it doesn't hit him, but there's a hole behind him, and he steps in the hole that nobody bothered to cover, which is OSHA regulation.
Mhm.
I forget what the number is, but it's an OSHA regulation that says you got to cover all the holes, anything bigger than 2 inches.
Yeah.
He falls in it, hurts his back, has to have a back surgery, and that's the case.
Mhm.
So, um, more serious than that are cases where explosions happen all the time, or
Oh, wow.
these are volatile chemicals under high pressure and heat, and so it happens. They lose control of it, get an explosion, and if people are lucky enough to live, they typically have head injuries from the concussive process, where they're thrown off a second floor balcony,
Mhm.
or not balcony, but oh,
Catwalk or something like that.
yeah, it's like a catwalk. They're thrown off there, and they land on the ground and break a leg and have a head injury, and maybe some burns to them, but they live. Or if they're not as fortunate, then they don't live.
Mhm.
So, and that those are tough cases to work on, both because of the accident and the result. But you're working with the family members that survived and have to learn how to live without that person in their life anymore. And as their lawyers, we're put in a position of back to being the guide. You're being not just a guide and a coach for the legal process, but how to pick up the pieces and start living again. If you can imagine, young wife with young kids, and her husband gets tragically injured or killed. Well, then suddenly, how are they going to pay for the mortgage and the groceries and the cars and the insurance? And so, we help them find loans to live on until the end of the case,
Mhm.
which is a major part of it. Just the financial pressures, or we help them find a way to take that financial pressure off.
Mhm. Wow. Okay. I think that's one important point that people maybe just don't realize about personal injury is like, how do you kind of survive financially in situations like that? What would you say some of the other common misconceptions that people may have about personal injury, the process? How do you start? Like anything along those lines? Things that when people come to you and talk about this, like, oh, I didn't know this was a thing, or I didn't know that I
So,
should have known this.
yeah, so the damages, everybody sees the lawyers that advertise the big jury damage awards, right?
Mhm.
But no one really understands what is underneath that. And so what you're really talking about are lost wages in the past, from the date of the injury to the date of trial. So
Mhm.
those are all your past lost wages. And then future lost wages. So from the date of the trial till the date that you would be presumed to be retiring, what would you have earned? Now, what do you subtract from that? If you can work now at any kind of job, and typically, if they've got serious injuries, then, maybe they can go do, some kind of minimum wage job, $10, $15 an hour. So the difference becomes, 30 or 40 years of what you used to make minus 30 or 40 years of minimum wage and that delta, that difference between the two becomes your future lost wages. Add to that your past medical expenses. And then typically there's going to be some projected future medical expenses. And those are going to come from your doctor saying, look, this guy's got these types of injuries. He's going to need this, that, or another thing for the next 30 or 40 years, depending on how long he has to live to the end of his life expectancy. And so those will cost X amount of dollars. And that becomes the basis for the damage awards that you see advertised, right? Now, the big ones, the really big ones, they also add to that pain, suffering, mental anguish, and or maybe punitive damages. And so those are the non-economic damages that juries get to decide how much is awarded. And it's typically, where you see the large ones, it's typically where they see some kind of betrayal of the victim, the plaintiff, by the defendant, and then the defendant treats them poorly in the process throughout the trial, and it makes the jury angry. And so you've got to have that, that convergence of betrayal, poor treatment, and then a jury that appreciates those things, and you'll get a very large award. at the end.
Okay. So now for those kind of the bigger cases, or I guess, yeah, the bigger case you were talking about, is that kind of more the exception than the norm? Like for every one of those big cases, are there 10, 100, 1,000 of the kind of like smaller personal injury cases? Or would you say like the big ones, there's a lot of big ones?
There's a lot of big ones. I mean, I'm hearing about judgments all the time. I mean, Tony Busby just like a week or two ago, maybe three, he just got a $1.1 billion judgment.
Wow.
So, I mean, there's huge judgments coming out of these courts all the time. But to your point, most 99.9% of all cases settle.
Mm.
And so there's an agreement between the defense and the plaintiff to, just settle all the claims for a sum certain, and it controls the outcome, gives the plaintiff some say and knowledge about what they're going to have, and it lets the defense get rid of, that liability or uncertainty with what they're going to have to pay out in the future. So,
okay.
And that's really, most cases, right? Everybody focuses on the big awards because we all like to imagine what we would do with the money.
Yeah, 1.1 billion.
Yeah. So
okay. Now, what would you say some of the biggest mistakes people make before they call a lawyer?
The biggest mistake I see is that they don't go get medical care.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the defense and adjusters in particular have this this game that they play where they point out gaps in treatment. And they try to frame that as if to say, this client wasn't injured because they have this gap in treatment. The problem with that is that what's common knowledge in our practice is that when you get injured, you went out and got in a car wreck today, and you called your PCP, and you wake up tomorrow morning, you're like, oh my God, my back hurts. Like, I feel like I've been run over. Hey, PCP, I need to come see you. I got in a car accident. Well, almost without fail, those doctors will say, I'm not seeing you for a car accident. I don't want to get involved. I don't want to be deposed. I don't want to have to deal with this. You're going to have to find someone else to treat you. Mm-hmm. So now you've been abandoned by your primary care physician. Mm-hmm. And, so everybody ends up going to the emergency room. And the emergency room is built around helping people that are on their way to death's bed. That's what they're there for, is to prevent people from dying. And so you show up with your back injury and they go, give him an x-ray, ship him out. So you end up with this very minor care, very minor diagnosis, and you're scratching your head. You're like, well, why isn't anybody telling me how to deal with this? So you just kind of flounder around. You don't go to a specialist, because you don't know one, right? The ER might have said, hey, go see an orthopedist. But they don't say, go see this orthopedist, John Smith, over here on the corner, who runs his own practice 3:00 on Tuesday. They just say, go see one. And so you flounder around for a month or two until your back hurts so bad that you don't know what to do about it. You end up calling a lawyer, and the lawyer goes, well, have you been to the doctor? Well, I went to the ER, but that was it. Mm-hmm. Well, why didn't you go to another doctor? My primary care physician told me he didn't want to be involved. All right. Well, have you thought about going to see an orthopedist or a neurosurgeon for your back injury? No, I don't know. I don't know any. So you get them to go to one of those. Before you know it, you got an MRI. That MRI is showing that they've got several herniated discs that they didn't have before. And now you've got a case. So, wow. But you've got a couple months in between where there's a gap in treatment, and the insurance is going to say, this didn't hurt him. It was something else that happened after the fact. And even though there may not be anything, they try to point to the imaginary event that caused the back injury.
Man, that's a very long and arduous process trying to get medical care and try to put this whole thing together.
Well, and it's, let's all be honest, going to the doctor is not fun. Mm-hmm. It takes, for a 30-minute appointment, it takes 2 or 3 hours out of your day. That's 2 or 3 hours that you would otherwise be at work. You would be earning money to pay your bills, etc. And, nobody wants to lose out on 2 or 3 hours of work just to go see the doctor and have them say, come back and see me in 3 to 4 weeks. And in the process, go get your MRIs, which is another 3 or 4 hours off work. And then come back when the MRIs are done and I'll talk to you about your MRIs. And so, it's a pain in the ass. And what drives people to do it is that they're in pain. And, even if they try not to do it, try to avoid it, eventually the pain is so intense and unforgiving that they give up and they go, okay, tell me what I need to do. I've got to do something about this pain. And that's when they typically, those who haven't gone to the doctor, they end up knocking on your door and asking, what do you recommend I do? I got to do something about this pain. And that's one of the big problems I see. One of the other big problems would be people who they don't want to admit that they're injured, because they're just not that person. Okay. They're like, I can suffer through this. This will end eventually. Well, what they don't know is that, it only takes 5.6 miles per hour of what they call a change in delta V in a car accident for the human body to suffer enough impact or effect of a force to damage or herniate a disc in their back, whether it's their neck or their lower back. So it doesn't take a lot of force. It doesn't take a big collision. It just takes them looking in the wrong direction, seated in the wrong way with a small impact, and we're off and running for them to have an injury for the rest of their life.
Wow. I didn't realize it was that slow of a speed compared to if you're in a car.
Right. I mean, you're talking about a 4,000-pound car going, 6 miles an hour, and all of that force, depending on how you're seated and depending on how you're, what age you are, maybe you've got some degenerative issues in your back already, and bam, and that's all it takes. So of course the defense is going to say that, that's not enough energy at all. It takes way more than that. It takes 10 miles an hour. So, they tend to disagree with the 6 mile an hour, but it doesn't take a whole lot more than that, according to them even.
Okay. Now, so let's say that somebody's gone through a situation that's got a car accident or got injured in some way, and then they're looking for a lawyer. But let's say, of course, they probably haven't worked with a personal injury attorney lawyer before. Hopefully they haven't, like that. It's not a common thing, but they're trying to find someone who's a good fit, but they don't know who to choose. They don't know anybody. What advice would you give to this person so that they can find that lawyer who is knowledgeable, is experienced, and can kind of help them get to the end result they're looking for?
So the biggest thing that I see that clients appreciate is our willingness to communicate with them and keep them informed. Because as we were talking about earlier, they don't understand the process. And so a lot of them end up, by virtue of frustration, just not understanding what's happening. And so they think it's over. They just think there's nothing to happen. But really in the background, we're doing a lot of work. We're, pushing on the other side. We're dealing with experts. We're trying to coordinate depositions and production of documents. And so they don't see all of our day-to-day activity. All they know is that when we call them every once in a while, or they call us and we return the call, we fill them in, and what I hear in them is a lot of relief. They're like, oh, thank you for letting me know what's happening. This is what, and part of that conversation is always, how is your condition? What is the doctor telling you? How is that, impacting you? Where are you at in the treatment process? And inevitably, you've got, a breakdown between the patient or the client and the doctor's office coordinating treatment. Somebody isn't calling somebody back. So you bridge that gap for them. You pick up the phone, you say, hey, they haven't heard from you. They're trying to schedule this appointment that was suggested, but they haven't heard back from you. Can we make that happen? And so, that's what I see as the communication aspect. Find an attorney who will communicate with you, has the staff to communicate with you, because it's a lot of background work, and you need somebody who's willing to pick up the phone and tell you what's happening.
Now, let's say there's this dichotomy that they're facing that, and you mentioned kind of earlier, sometimes throughout this process, it may be a year, 2 years, 3 years going through this entire process. So should people take a look at finding a lawyer that they really like and they connect with, or a lawyer that really has very strong ability and experience to get a favorable outcome? Now, I know in a perfect world, you want to have both, someone that has the ability, but also you really like and can connect with. But if people had to choose, which one would you say you would probably put more weight behind, the likability and the connection, or the ability?
They're not always disconnected. I mean, I've met lawyers through the Jerry Spence Trial College that are very good at both, and I work here with Tony Busby, who's very good at getting a good outcome, right? He connects with the clients too. He just, he has so many cases, it's hard for him to focus in on any one case, at a time, because his time is so valuable that he spends it in the court, in the depositions, and that sort of thing. So he really relies on us to connect with the clients. But I guess if I had to answer the question, I'd say the connection part of it is the most important part, because without that connection, I, as the attorney, don't really know what the client's story is. And developing that story is how you connect with the jury. And that's straight out of the Jerry Spence handbook. I mean, it's all about connection. And part of that is knowing the vulnerabilities of the client so that they can be demonstrated and communicated to the jury. And that jury then hopefully connects with the client.
Okay. Very well said. Now, Bret, is there any changes about when it comes to the future of personal injury law, like anything that people should really kind of pay attention to, or just be aware of when it comes, like, are there any kind of major changes coming down the pike?
Sure. I mean, AI is, it's here on top of us.
Yeah.
It's become common practice. A client sends you an email and it's obviously an AI product. They have asked AI a question about their case, gotten this feedback from AI, and they've then sent it to you as a question from them to you, right? And and so that's here. It's changing their perspectives, because now they're not so focused on us as their guide. They've got ChatGPT or Claude or whoever telling them what to think. And so we've got AI looking over our shoulder, and we've got to be able to, explain why we've done what we've done, what our strategy is, what our trial tactic is. So those types of things are not always, as we talked about earlier, not understood by the client. Trial tactics and strategies and that sort of thing. I mean, they're just getting them used to the process by itself is enough to take up, most of my time. But then sometimes now I find myself having, well, this is why I'm doing this, which is dangerous. It becomes a problem because the more you explain to your client, the more they're likely to say something in a deposition that hurts the case. So if I explain to them what a strategy is, and then they go, well, this is what my lawyer's going to do, you just gave away the strategy. So it's coming, it's here. And it's not entirely bad, but it's dangerous.
So people should be cautiously optimistic about it.
I think, yeah, I mean, that sounds like a good term. It's a different perspective. I've had somebody bring something up like that, and I was like, I didn't think about it that way. Like that, let's look at that. How do we develop that? And then on the other hand, I've had people, come at me, like they're shooting the 6-shooter, like, ChatGPT says you ought to be doing this, 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 and this. How come you haven't done it yet? Whoa, like, hold on a second. We're doing that. It's in the background. It's happening. You just aren't aware of it, So, I mean, video is a big thing in every case. Is there surveillance video from any kind of nearby source that captured the event or the aftermath of the event, and the aftermath can be very important. You have brain injury cases, TBIs. And one of the things that the defense always wants to argue is that there was no evidence that immediately after the accident that there was any kind of alteration of their cognitive abilities or, and you may get a video that shows them it doesn't really clock for anybody. Nobody's taking notes. But right after the accident, your client has to sit down on the ground because they can't stand. Or they vomit multiple times, and then, they never really thought anything about it. They just, to them, it was just an event. That's kind of what happened after the fact. And it becomes important evidence for a TBI. And surveillance showed it, right? And you go, what do you mean there's no evidence of alteration? The video shows it clearly. And then the expert that you're talking to goes, oh, well, I wasn't aware of that. Nobody showed me that. Mm-hmm. Could be, yes, could be, but doesn't necessarily mean it absolutely is. And that's the game they always play. Possible, but not problem.
Okay. Good to know then. Okay. Well, Bret, I do have one last question for you, but before I ask it, I do want to point people to your website at moneydamage.com. Now, last question for you, Bret. What does peace of mind mean to you?
Peace of mind. I've done everything I can do to help someone, and it's in the jury's hands now. That's peace of mind.
Okay. Well, there you have it. Bret sharing his expertise. So, Bret, where can people contact you and your practice?
Call me on my cell, 832-715-4235, or email me, Bret, B-R-E-T, at moneydamage.com.
Okay, awesome. Well, Bret, this is awesome. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, and thanks for sharing your expertise.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Verdict Signal podcast. Any questions? Please contact the practice directly with the contact information provided during the show. We'll see you again next time. Bye for now.